Matthew 7. I'm going to read the first 20 verses of Matthew 7. Judge not, that you be not judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when there is the log in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Do not give dogs what is holy. Do not throw pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you shall find. Knock, and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks it will be opened. Or which one of you, if his son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do to them, for this is the law and the prophets. Enter by the narrow gate. For the gate is wide, the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow, and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. Beware false prophets, who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes, or figs from thistles? So every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will recognize them by their fruits. I'm also going to read a little bit from John 8, just to keep that fresh in your mind. So John 8, I'm going to turn over to John 8, and I'm going to look at the first few verses of John 8, the woman caught in adultery. Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and placing her in the midst, they said to him, Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now, in the law of Moses commanded us to stone such women. So, what do you say? They said this to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her. And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? She said, No one, Lord. Jesus said, Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on sin no more. So we're going to take these two passages together in order to think about one of those things that I hear quite often. Now, one of my little habits is to look for Scripture in the wild. You know, this culture that we call our own, in all of its many, many different corners, has, despite its best efforts, been deeply influenced by Christianity. It simply can't quite forget it, as much as it tries. So if this is true, we're going to see little pockets and corners here and there of Christian teaching popping up in unexpected places. So you might see a little verse from Philippians on Steph Curry's shoe as he plays basketball. And you might hear somebody say, maybe in a yard sign, Judge not, lest you be judged. I'm curious, has anybody ever heard that as a rejoinder in an argument? Well, you can't say that because you can't judge me. Okay, almost everybody is raising their hands. Okay, that is, I would say, a common worldly interpretation of a biblical principle. Now, I want to talk about this tonight because it's a very common thing. And one of the things I'll ask you after the service is what Bible verses you've seen out in the wild, in the public sphere. What do you see as things that people bring up from the Bible? I'm kind of curious about that. You can tell me after. So the NIV says, that's the New International Version, do not judge or you too will be judged. The ESV, we just read that, says, judge not that you be not judged. Now, you're going to hear a little plug for the language of the King James right now. I don't often do that. Emma is just a little disturbed. But here's what we've lost, just a little something in the English language. You guys ready for this? So in the King James, what does it say? Judge not lest ye be judged. Okay, what does that little word ye offer in this particular verse? It's plural. You know what? We've lost that. As languages get older, generally, and you might say as cultures get more comfortable and less able to present a particularly direct version of the truth, you find that languages simplify. And this is one way that I don't think English has gained anything. So sometimes, if you're in Pittsburgh, you hear yins. If you're in the South, you hear y'all. And if you're in Philadelphia or New York, what do you hear? Use. Okay? It's a U with an S at the end. And when I came from the West Coast and heard use for the first time, I thought, we're filling in a little bit of a gap. Now, why does that matter so much here? Well, guess what it is in the original Greek language that Jesus has given to us? Guess what that little U is? It's a plural U. So we really should be saying, do not judge, or all of you too will be judged. Or in the ESV, do not judge not, that all of you might not be judged. That's the idea. So there's a collective there that I think is quite helpful. That's the first thing, because we like to interpret things in very individual terms. Well, you can't judge me, okay? And this verse points to a plural. For a world that's steeped, now I'm going to go out on a little bit of a limb here and say, how do people usually think of justice coming from ways that do not involve, let's say, retribution or people coming up against each other to get their own revenge? Have you ever heard that word karma? Okay, it gets used a lot. Some people say karmic justice, or the universe bends toward justice. Well, the universe does no such thing. The universe is cold. It's rather nasty and sterile. The earth is the place we should be. And by the way, God is the God of it. And if there is any justice in the world, it comes from a living God who actually accomplishes that justice. Why do I say this? Because I think that there is a feeling that people have. We sometimes hear, you shouldn't judge because judging someone in general can result in bad things for you. That's sort of a karmic way of thinking, isn't it? That's a way of thinking that says, yeah, if you make a judgment, it's going to come back and bite you in the end. And for the world that we are trying to build, that is to say, a world which is increasingly ready for the kingdom of God, if we're trying to think like Jesus, we need to dig deeper than that. First confusion. Matthew 7. So we read Matthew 7, began with, judge not that you be not judged. It's often confused with John 8. I've heard people say that Jesus says to the woman caught in adultery, judge not lest ye be judged. And that's why the people dropped their stones and walked away. But you notice that passage that we read does not have that in it. It has something very similar, and I think there's exactly the same ethical teaching. This is the same Jesus in both cases. But you do not have that phrase in John 8. There are two different times. There's similar advice, but not quite the same advice. In Matthew 7, Jesus is giving ethical instruction on many topics. And in John 8, he is applying his ethical ideas and instruction and laws to a tricky case that is brought to try to trip him up. In John 8, Jesus faces down what we might call today a lynch mob. Okay, that's what's happening in John 8. There are people ready to exact a certain type of street justice on this woman who is caught in adultery. Now, where's the man in this case? That's often been noted. The man in this case probably ought to be up there with her, which is one of the contributions that Christianity has made to the world. The so-called double standard ought not to be there. There's no question of the guilt in this case. Maybe she was even the perfect case where there was no doubt about her guilt because she was caught in the act. And Jesus, in fact, does not question the guilt. And he says something very similar to the judge not statement. Let him who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. So, hey, all of you with the rocks, disperse this lynch mob, is what Jesus said. Don't you know that you are going to be judged by the same standard? Now here, there is a little bit of conjecture, but more than one commentator has suggested when Jesus writes in the sand, what do you think he wrote? It was obviously incriminating. Was it names? Was it circumstances or dates? I don't know. But whatever it was that he wrote that is not recorded for us, convinced the mob to go away. If they were to judge the woman in this particular case, Jesus is reminding them, I know all. I have this list of sins. And by the way, you're about to exact a justice which is fully unjust. It's an application of judge not, lest you be judged. In fact, when he writes in the sand, there is something that is very incriminating and convicting for those who are there. It's interesting that the old men leave first. What does that suggest? That means that the people who are most full of understanding and have lived the longest life get what's going on. And they see it. And they drop their stones. The older, wiser ones leave first. So in Matthew 7, here's what Jesus says. When he says, judge not that you be not judged, judge not lest ye not be judged. He is saying, don't be a hypocrite. When he says, ask, and it will be given to you, Jesus is saying that we should ask God for the good things that God gives us. And then we have the teaching that is sometimes called the golden rule. But we also have, along with the golden rule, a warning to us that taking the easy way out does not fulfill the golden rule. And then we are to judge people by their fruit. And I went through the 4 paragraphs here to get to the 4th paragraph, which says, judge people by their fruit. Beware false prophets who come. You will recognize them by their fruits. That is an act of judgment. Don't mistake wolves for sheep. So the advice that people commonly give, we can't possibly make judgments or decisions because God said not to, is certainly not true. Let's look at the first one, the hypocrite rule. Okay, so in Matthew 23, we'll just turn a little bit later in the same book, Matthew 23. The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So do and observe, and they say, so do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do, for they preach, but they do not practice. So what is hypocrisy? There's a famous line in the English language that's come down to us now. It's practice what you preach. It comes right from this biblical passage, right? Practice what you preach. If we say, judge not that you be not judged, the first meaning of that is that we should practice what we preach. Whatever we say people ought to do, we ought to do ourselves. Especially if you have some position of leadership or authority. Leaders who don't do what they require of the people under them are either tyrants or hypocrites. Neither one is a particularly desirable thing. Think of a certain governor who dined in a fancy restaurant during COVID while making everyone else stay away from restaurants and use masks. Do you remember that? That got people pretty angry, didn't it? Or think of a recent case of a CEO and an HR director caught in adultery on a camera. Did you see those memes? Okay? It's obnoxious not so much because of the adultery, which is pretty bad. We'll grant that. But there's hypocrisy. The people who are making the rules are flaunting the rules. This is the same HR director who would come after you and fire you because you carried on a workplace romance with somebody. Hypocrisy. You know, it's interesting. I find with children, I've had a few, that one of the first things that they can find is hypocrisy. They don't call it that, but they know something's wrong. How could you do this if you've just told me not to do the same thing? There's a sense of fairness there, and it is finely tuned. I think it's just built into who we are as human beings. Check me if I'm wrong. Is that true? So judge not, lest you be judged. Well, if you're going to judge somebody, you better have the life to back up what you are doing. That is certainly part of the teaching there. Part 2, ask and it will be given. Here's an alternative to judging others. Spend time asking God for what you need and lack. Obnoxious judging is certainly something to avoid. Being the one who knows what's best for everyone is not what we want for the Christian life. It's much better to be the one who asks God for things. So you can either be the know-it-all who says, yes, I know the law, I know everything in it, I tithe my mint and rue, or you can be the person who says, I have to go to God in order to request God's grace again and again and again. And asking God means that you are fulfilling what Jesus wanted you to do in the Beatitudes. You are needy. You are poor in spirit. This is the way to salvation. Judging the lack of others is not the way to salvation, but seeing the lack in yourself certainly is. And seeing that and asking God to fill what is lacking. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. That's quite a promise, isn't it? What this promise says is if you seek God, guess what you are going to find? God. That is a promise which you can certainly take into eternity. Seek God and you will find God. Everyone who asks receives. The one who seeks finds. And to the one who knocks, the door will be opened. And then Jesus makes a point with some humor. I hope it's humor at least. Okay? Which of you, being evil fathers, give your children bad gifts? If your son asks for a fish, do you give him a snake instead? If you who are evil know how to give good gifts, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? Part 3, the golden rule. Whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them. This is the law and the prophets. We spent some time this morning with a summary of the law that was love God and love your neighbor. This is another summary of the law. Another summary of the law is whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets, sometimes called the golden rule. If you replace the word do with judge, so whatever you wish that others would judge about you, judge also about them. Then we merge the two ideas, judge not that you be not judged, with the golden rule. The golden rule and the instruction about judging are very, very similar. However you would like to be judged, judge others. Jesus adds an important principle to this. Notice at the end what he says about narrow and wide gates. Which would you rather go through, a narrow door or a wide door? The narrow door is harder, isn't it? And yet if you follow the law of God, if you follow this golden rule that says whatever you wish others would do to you, do to them, you're going to find that this door is narrow. It is harder to do. It is harder to make sure that you are acting in such a way that you would prefer that others act around you. It is the narrow road. And the fourth part, the tree and its fruit. Beware the false prophets. There are wolves that need to be found, judged, and rejected. I don't know about you, but I sure pass a lot of churches on the way to anywhere I go in the city. There are many, many churches. Unfortunately, not all of them preach the truth. And I think we could get a lot of perspective from people who have been around a while and who have been inside some of those churches. But it's very interesting. Inside the churches, Satan would love to send in wolves to prey on the people that are there. And so sometimes the leadership becomes wolf-like and consumes the sheep that are inside instead of shepherding them. That needs to be found, judged, and rejected. Surely, in saying, "Judge not, that you not be judged," Jesus is not saying that we should not reject false teaching. But there is a way to find the wolves that Jesus gives us right here that I think avoids some of the problems that we might have with jumping to premature judgment. We are to judge their fruits. This is one of the reasons that it is important to hold the leaders in a church or even the leaders of a country to a higher standard of ethics. We judge their fruits. You will recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? The goal of the Christian life is to be a fruitful tree that brings forth fruit in the season that is appropriate for it. Wolves do not do this. People who teach for their own benefit do not do this. Judge others with the same level of scrutiny that you would like to be judged. Judging by fruits is possible by everyone who can see the fruits. You also, by the way, will be judged by your fruits. You know, we spend a lot of time in a Protestant church appropriately saying, you are not saved by your works. True? Absolutely true. Maybe we should also spend some time saying, will you be judged for your works? What's the answer to that? The answer is yes. You will be judged for your works. The fruits that you bring forth are part of what God is going to use to judge you. Now, quite fortunately for us, we have Jesus covering us, so that those fruits which are imperfect, coming from a sinful heart, will nonetheless be counted as righteous as God sees them, thanks to the blood of Christ. But the fruits that are brought out are the public side of your treeness. If you are a tree, you know the tree by the fruits that it brings out. And those fruits that you bring out show what is inside, far better than any of the words that you use. The fruits from a sheep are very different from the fruit of a wolf. Some other notes about proper judging. I hope you're convinced that, yes, Jesus wants us to judge in the right way and for the right reasons. You know, sometimes there is a problem with who has the authority when there is judgment passed. Have you ever heard somebody say in a family, "I already have a mother"? That phrase might come from somebody who is feeling like there is, maybe a sibling who has decided to pass some judgment on another that probably ought to come from a parent. Or maybe in the workplace, there is a judgment that comes from somebody else where you say, well, you know what, if the boss says that, I'll listen, but I'm not sure it's your place to do it. So who does God give authority to make certain judgments? Parents, elders, bosses, city judges, people at the county level. Think of government, think of family, think of church. In each of those places, there is leadership, and there is a proper place for judgment to take place. Each has a limited and not absolute authority, though. So in each of those spheres, If I go to somebody else's family and I start rebuking a child, I would hope that they would listen, and I would hope that I would have the backing of their parents, but I would not be taking place of their parents, because that would not be my place. If I am a principal of a school and I go into another school and I start telling the kids of that school how to behave, well, it might be good advice, but I would not be the one in the direct line to them. I would not have that God-given authority to that particular person in order to give that instruction. God gave whatever authority people have, and some of that authority, much of it, is fully legitimate. But only God has ultimate authority. So if you want to know where the buck stops, where the judgment stops, that stops at God's judgment seat. So one of the things that anybody who sits in judgment needs to keep in mind is that their authority to judge things is limited. So in Psalm 58, we read, "You might be gods." God is talking to the human judges that he's appointed, or human leaders. "But can you speak righteously?" God is saying, remember who you are. I know you're writing laws. I know you are writing all those things that people have to follow. But remember who you are before me. Can you truly speak righteousness? You better be writing down laws that are truly righteous in front of you. By the way, I heard a lecture one time from somebody that many of you know, Bill Chellis. He was at camp, at White Lake Camp, and we were talking about the way that our professions meshed with the Christian life. And I thought for sure a lawyer, because that's what he is, would have all sorts of criticisms about the government. Well, he had some, but his main message to us was this: most laws that are made are actually in accordance with God's will. That was a bit of a surprising sort of insight for me. He definitely disagreed with some laws. But he said that the main thrust of his profession, legally, was actually godly. And I found that quite striking. I did not expect to hear that from a lawyer. Usually you hear a whole lot more cynicism. But he was actually quite happy to say, yes, this is God's work. I would say the same thing as a school teacher. The rules that are enforced in school are, well, they're sometimes arbitrary and silly. I'll agree with that, every bit of the way. But the fundamental thrust of them is to maintain order and an environment where people truly can learn. There's nothing wrong with that. And so in that way, a school is enforcing God's law to provide an order in which people may learn. But we shouldn't take more than God gives. That authority is limited. You know what? Even the authority of a parent is limited. If you were a Roman father, guess what you could do to your child? You actually had power of life and death. Roman fathers were in charge in a big way. Not Roman mothers as much, but Roman fathers certainly. This is a very different picture of that. The authority that God gives to Christian parents is limited. Children, obey your parents. What's the next part? In the Lord. In the Lord. The next thing I'd mention, judge or reprove in proportion to the sin. You know, there's a principle in the Old Testament law of proportionality. Some sins are bigger, or I love the Westminster Confession, it says more heinous than others. That word heinous means serious, okay? More serious, more offending to God. But all sins are an offense to God. We need to judge or reprove in proportion to that sin. When the law says eye for eye and tooth for tooth, it is not saying that this is the penalty that needs to be applied. If you lose a tooth, the other person has to lose a tooth too. No, that's not what we're looking for. What we're looking for is the idea of proportionality. If you have an offense over here, a man has stolen something. Well, in this day and age, what do we do with somebody who steals something? We put him in jail. Well, that's useless. You know what they did in the old law? They'd make him pay it back. Of course. My goodness. You know, the problem is some types of sin can't be taken back. Stealing is pretty easy as sin goes. Other types of sin are much, much more serious. and those you cannot repay. In fact, I'm not sure you can repay stealing either. You can pay back the stuff, but can you pay back the trust that you have just taken away from that person? That's much more difficult. That's where the blood of Jesus is required. But everything in proportion. You should not, if you're a civil leader, assign a death penalty for somebody who takes a loaf of bread from the corner store or something like that. So proportionality. The judgment should fit the crime. And the judge should not judge for the sake of personal vendetta. A judge should not be involved in the case that they are judging. We have this idea enshrined in law that we can't be part of a judgment when we have a personal interest in the case. So the impartiality of the judges ought to be maintained, whether that's through law or practice or however that is done. There are some cases that we consider on the session of this church where one elder or another removes themselves from the discussion and says, I have too much in this. We had a case a couple of years ago where all elders had to remove ourselves and ask for presbytery then to be a part of the judgment because we felt we could not, having played such a personal part in it. So judges should not be involved in the case that they are judging. The judges should be subject to the same law they use. This is the anti-hypocrisy part of things. So if you're going to make a law as a legislator and then enforce it as a judge, you better make sure that you are subject to the same law. So a judge shouldn't get a speeding ticket and then be able to say, yeah, I'm a judge, I should get out of that. Nope. Judge should pay it. In fact, in theory, if you have a speeding motorcade that's going through Philadelphia, you ought to be able to have a state trooper pull him over and say, Mr. President, here's your ticket. Now, I doubt that would ever happen, but in theory, maybe it would make some good political theater because it would make a point, wouldn't it, that even the president is not outside of the judgment of the law. Judges are not God. Judges have a limited power. So the type of zealotry that sometimes comes up when you give some... You know what? The smaller the judgment that needs to be made, sometimes the bigger leap people try to make. Have you ever heard of HOAs? There are some interesting stories. These are homeowner associations. They are groups of houses where people all agree to follow the same rules. And sometimes people get zealous about this, and they want to enforce things, and they become little petty tyrants for the 100 neighbors that they have around them. My goodness, let's avoid that, please. That's just silly. Judges aren't God. And when people start to play that, all sorts of distortions happen. We can laugh about that one. I mean, that's just annoying. But when that starts to happen on a national scale, that's also known as tyranny. So what's the larger connection here? We say that everything that is written in the Scriptures should point us toward Jesus. God himself is judge. Jesus puts into action these judgments. To the woman caught in adultery, Jesus says, then neither do I judge you. Does he have the authority to do that? Well, only God does, right? But God chose at that point to say, I do not condemn you. Jesus is perfect. There is no better judge than Jesus himself. As the perfect judge, his role will change in time. And I need to emphasize this because it is the same Jesus now as it will be in the future and as he was in the past. Jesus brought creation into being. He is now our king. And in the future, he will certainly bring the judgments to us. The perfect judge, but his role changes in time. Right now, a few pages later in Matthew 11:28. Let's see here. So Matthew 11:28, we read this. Come to me, all who are labor and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart. You will find rest for your souls. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. That's the call that Jesus is sending out right now. Jesus at the end of time. Well, let's turn to Revelation, and we see a different picture of the same God, of the same man. Revelation 1, we read, John says, "When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead, but he laid his right hand on me, saying, 'Fear not, I am the first and the last, the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys to death and hell.'" What an interesting combination. Lays his hand on John, who is prostrate before him, quite rightly fearing God himself. And he feels God's hand on him. And then the words that are powerful and yet comforting at the same time. "I am the first and the last. I also have the keys to hell itself in my hand." Jesus will judge. He is the perfect judge. Luke 7 gives us the parable of the moneylender. This tells us a little bit about Jesus' way of judging that's very similar to the judge not that we read in Matthew. Remember that. The moneylender forgives an enormous, impossible-to-pay debt. And then the debtor goes out and tries to squeeze one of his underlings for a small debt. That's an example of judge not lest you be judged, right? So don't try to collect on a small debt when you have been forgiven a very large debt. Or how about the unmerciful servant in Matthew 18:21? Who loves Jesus more, one who is forgiven less or one who is forgiven more? By the way, the moneylender in the parable is perfectly righteous. He has the right to collect his debt, but he chooses not to. There are deeper debts, of course, in the world than money. Money is pretty easy as debts go. Money is straightforward. People either have it or they don't. They pay it or they don't. But there are much, much deeper debts that get written in this world. There's the debt of rebellion, of betrayal. Is there any way to really repay rebellion or betrayal? There's no money or time sufficient to repay these debts, humanly speaking. But you know what? All debts are paid somehow. Any debt that has ever been incurred in the world is paid somehow. Let's say that somebody borrows $20 from you and never repays it. Who paid that debt? Well, the person that lent the money paid the debt. That debt is paid, you see. Okay? Now, it's not paid in the way that it should be, but it's still paid. Any debt that's ever been taken out is paid in some way. And judgment demands action. Fortunately for us right now, God is slow to act. What does that mean for us in our human interactions? Should we be quick in the way that we judge others in our righteousness? Or should we be slow and patient? You know, sometimes we complain about the courts and the people who are in power being very, very slow. And there are times for really quick judgment and assessment. If you're a parent, don't delay things. But also, be patient. Have a patience that goes along with that quick judgment. Because God is slow to anger, and yet his judgment is righteous. Some people wonder why God doesn't immediately punish sin or give out judgment right away. I wouldn't really want to ask for that. This is because we live right now on borrowed time. Our time right now is being before a perfect judge who is also very patient and gracious. The judgment is coming, but it is not here yet, which gives us time. We can't make up for all the betrayals and rebellions that we have committed in our lives, but we can turn to Jesus right now. Jesus will judge. God's judgment will happen. And God and Jesus will also be very patient as we call on him right now. There's only one way to avoid the penalty that all of us justly deserve, and that is to go to Jesus and to call on him. When we are called to judge in our properly earthly spheres, we should remember to judge honestly but not harshly, not with revenge, but with mind to turning hearts to God. We should be discerning but not condemning as we deal with the people around us. Are there people that you know who have left Jesus? Pray for them. There's still time. There is still time. The judge is in his chambers, but the trial hasn't started. And the beauty of this is that you have as your defender Jesus himself. Amen to that.